One stormy night, Peter Van Garrett was riding his carriage through the fields when he hears mysterious sounds of horse behind him. He peeked out the window and saw his driver's head get chopped off. Terrified, Peter jumped out of the carriage and ran through the field. He stopped when he saw a scarecrow and heard something coming closer. When he turned around, a scythe swung down and cuts off his head. In 1799, in New York City, Police Constable Ichabod Crane found a body floating in the city river. Despite Ichabod's protests to investigate the man's death properly, his colleagues insisted on burning the body. Ichabod believed strongly in science and justice, but his peers didn't agree. Soon, he was sent to a small town called Sleepy Hollow to investigate a series of murders. As Ichabod traveled to his new assignment, he looked at the scars on his hands and wondered what the town had in store for him. When he arrived in Sleepy Hollow, he felt the town's fear and paranoia. He walked up to a big house, ignoring a couple making out in the shadows. Accidentally interrupting a party game, he looks for the head of the house. He received a kiss from the daughter, Katrina Van Tassel, and met her unfriendly suitor, Brom Van Brunt. Ichabod introduced himself to Katrina's father, the wealthy businessman Balthus Van Tassel, and met his second wife, Mary Preston, now called Lady Van Tassel. The Van Tassels let Ichabod stay with them for the rest of his time in Sleepy Hollow. As he unpacked his things in his room, a maid named Sarah told him how thankful she was that a constable had arrived. Ichabod was invited by Van Tassel to his private study, where he met the town elders, the local doctor, Dr. Thomas Lancaster, Reverend Steenwick, the magistrate, Samuel Phillips, and the notary, James Hardenbrook. Ichabod shared what he knew about the case. 3 people had been murdered: Peter Van Garrett, his son Dirk, and the widow Winship. All of them were found with their heads separated from their bodies. The elders corrected Ichabod that the heads were never found. They believed the Headless Horseman took them. The Headless Horseman was a mercenary from the Revolutionary War who loved battle and rode a big black horse named Daredevil. He even sharpened his teeth to look scarier. He rode into battles, chopping off his enemies' heads. His story ended in 1779 when soldiers shot his horse near Western Woods, which was very close to Sleepy Hollow. The soldiers chased him into the woods, where he stumbled upon 2 little girls gathering firewood. One of the girls made a noise, giving away his location. The soldiers fought him and eventually chopped off his head with his own sword. They buried him in an unmarked grave deep in the woods, and ever since, his spirit haunted the area. The town elders believed the horseman was now chopping off any head he saw. Ichabod was very confused and anxious to hear the story, so they handed him a Bible. Inside, he noticed a family tree of the Van Garretts and Van Tassels. Later that night, one of Van Garrett's servants, Jonathan Mosbath, was standing guard at the edge of the town, watching for the terrifying Headless Horseman. As he aimed his gun at the fog, he saw something scary. A loud shot rang out. A horse neighed, and in seconds, Jonathan was running through the dark, spooky woods, chased by the Headless Horseman. Sadly, the horseman caught up to him and with one swift slice of his sword, cut off Jonathan's head. The next morning, Ichabod met Mr. Killian, who lent him a horse. Ichabod also met Mr. Killian's family, his wife, Beth, who helped deliver babies, and their son, Thomas. Suddenly, the townsfolk fired a gun to alert everyone of another terrible murder. Ichabod hurried to the crime scene, where the town elders were already gathered around Jonathan Mosbath's body. Ichabod scolded the elders for moving the body and wondered why the Headless Horseman was taking the heads if the bodies could still be identified. Usually, heads are taken so the bodies cannot be identified. Ichabod continued to investigate, using his special scientific tools. He noticed that Jonathan's wound was burned shut, meaning the sword must have been incredibly hot. The town elders shivered at the gruesome thought. Later that day, the town held a funeral for Jonathan. Ichabod decided to take Jonathan's orphaned son, young Mosbath, under his care. As the funeral ended, the magistrate Phillips approached Ichabod and revealed a shocking secret. Jonathan was the 5th victim, not the 4th. There were 5 victims buried in 4 graves. Ichabod suddenly had an idea and ordered young Mosbath to wake him before dawn. Early the next morning, Ichabod and young Mosbath dug up all 4 graves. When Ichabod examined widow Winship's body, he noticed a cut on her stomach. He took her body to the town doctor's office and did more investigations. Ichabod wondered why the horseman would cut off her head and stab her in the stomach too. After hours of examining, a bloody and tired Ichabod came out and announced to the town elders that Widow Winship had been pregnant when she was killed. That evening, Ichabod crossed the town bridge with his horse. He heard a sound and saw the headless horseman at the end of the bridge. Terrified, he ran into the dark woods to escape the horrifying horseman. Ichabod stops and looks around nervously. Suddenly, the horseman throws a blazing pumpkin head at him. Terrified, Ichabod doesn't realize that this horseman is a fake. It's actually Brahm playing a cruel prank. That night, Ichabod has a dream about his mother. He remembers her drawing circles by the hearth and tucking him into bed with his favorite red cardinal paper toy. But he also recalls a frightening man lurking in the shadows. Waking up thirsty, Ichabod goes downstairs for a glass of water. He hears a noise and finds Katrina reading by the fire. She tells him her mother died 2 years ago, and now her stepmother, Mary Preston, is Lady Van Tassel. When Ichabod asks why no one mentioned that the Van Tassels are related to the Van Garretts, Katrina explains that almost everyone in Sleepy Hollow is connected by blood or marriage. Katrina shares how her father came to this place as a poor man. Van Garrett gave him a rundown cottage and an acre of land. Her father worked hard, prospered, and gave her the life she enjoys today. She gives Ichabod a book of spells for protection and takes him to the old cottage where they used to live. There, Katrina notices scars on Ichabod's hands. She draws a symbol in the ashes of the old fireplace, and Ichabod gasps. It's the same symbol his mother drew in his dreams. Later that night, Ichabod overhears the town elders holding a secret meeting. The magistrate, Phillips, has packed his bags and plans to leave town. Ichabod follows him to the fields and confronts him about Widow Winship and her child. Phillips admits the widow asked for his help to protect her child's rights, and he was sworn to keep it a secret. He knows who the father is and insists it was the horseman who killed her. Feeling frustrated, Ichabod denies the existence of the horseman. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by the creepy, ghostly bleating of goats in the dark. Phillips gasped in horror as he saw the shadow of the headless horseman galloping towards them. Terrified, the magistrate tried to run, but the horseman caught up and chopped off his head. Ichabod fell to the ground as Phillips's head rolled towards him. The headless horseman swooped in and took the head with his sword, just before Ichabod fainted. When Ichabod woke up, Van Tassel, Katrina, and young Mosbath were by his side. Hysterical, Ichabod told them that the horseman really did exist before fainting again. He dreamed of his mother, playing in the forest as it snowed. The dream turned dark as young Ichabod saw his mother being abused by a horrible man. Waking up, Ichabod announced to the town elders that he would go to the western woods to find the horseman's grave. Only young Mosbath accompanied him. Along the way, Ichabod learned that Mosbath's father had worked for the Van Garretts and had a big argument with them a week before their deaths. They ventured deeper into the woods and stopped near a cave. As they approached, they heard a woman's voice. Ichabod drew his gun, and they cautiously entered the cave, finding a veiled woman who was clearly a witch. The witch took Ichabod inside and ordered Mosbath to wait outside. She chained herself up and prepared a ritual, demanding silence as Ichabod asked about the horseman. Suddenly, the witch jumped at him, her eyes and tongue sticking out in a scary way. In a hoarse voice, she commanded him to follow the Indian trail to where the sun dies, where they would find the tree of the dead and the horseman's resting place. Ichabod broke free and fled with Mosbath. They rode their horses in search of the tree of the dead. Soon, they stopped on the trail and Ichabod spotted a shadow. Drawing his gun, he found a white horse and its rider. It was Katrina, who had followed them. Their conversation was cut short by Mosbath, who led them to a gigantic, twisted tree in the middle of the woods. They had found the tree of the dead. Ichabod chopped at the tree roots, finding them full of blood. As he continued, the roots revealed a hiding place filled with severed heads. Ichabod realized the tree was a gateway between two worlds. Climbing up the tree, he uncovered the Hessian skeleton, but the skull was missing. He told them that this was why the horseman kept taking heads. He wouldn't stop until his own head was returned. Suddenly, rumbling came from the pile of severed heads. Ichabod, Katrina, and Mosbath watched in terror as the pile opened up and out came the headless horseman on his giant steed, Daredevil. The Hessian galloped away, searching for his next victim. Ichabod quickly followed. The horsemen arrived at the Killian's house and swiftly killed Mr. Killian. Beth managed to hide Thomas in the basement and cowered in the corner as the horseman entered with her husband's head. She too was decapitated, and the horsemen showed no mercy, even for little Thomas. Meanwhile, Brom, on guard duty, heard the screams and saw the horseman. He fired at him, knocking him off his horse. The headless body moved towards Brom, who fought back bravely. The Hessian threw a knife at Brom's knee, hindering him. Ichabod arrived and tried to help, stabbing the horseman in the back. They ran towards the bridge, but the horseman surprised them, stabbing Ichabod in the shoulder and tossing him aside. The horseman lured Brom onto the bridge and fought him fiercely before finally cutting him in half. Ichabod watched in horror as the headless horseman walked away before fainting again. Guys, I urge you to subscribe so that we can make more movie recaps together. Back at Van Tassel's house, Dr. Lancaster inspected Ichabod's wounds, surprised they had fared well with little bleeding. When Ichabod woke up, he apologized to Katrina for defending Brom. He explained that the horseman didn't kill at random. Someone alive was controlling him by using his skull. His theory was dismissed as Katrina made him drink a homebrewed potion. Ichabod slept and dreamed of the horrible man again, who was now the headless horseman. He entered a room full of torture devices and accidentally stabbed his hands before finding his mother dead with countless wounds. Waking up in a panic, Ichabod ran into Katrina's arms. Ichabod revealed to Katrina that his mother was murdered by his father in a twisted attempt to save her soul. He was only 7 years old when he lost her and his faith in religion. As Ichabod and Katrina grew closer, they showed their vulnerable sides and shared an intimate embrace. By morning, Ichabod laid out the facts of the case with Moss Bath. He suspected a conspiracy among the town elders, who were arguing the night the magistrate was murdered. Ichabod decided to record every man and woman in Sleepy Hollow, starting with the chief citizen, Lord Van Tassel. Moss Bath agreed, noting that Van Tassel must be the chief citizen now since the Van Garretts were dead. Suddenly, Ichabod had an idea and took Moss Bath to see the notary. At Hardenbrook's office, Moss Bath found his father's satchel. They learned from the notary that with the Van Garretts dead, the estate would pass to the next of kin, the Van Tassels. Moss Bath then revealed a document from his father's satchel. Peter Van Garrett had created a new will, leaving his estate to the widow Winship and their unborn child. Hardenbrook admitted he was unwillingly pulled into the plot. Ichabod concluded that Reverend Steenwick knew about the marriage because he performed the ceremony. Dr. Lancaster attended the pregnant woman, Magistrate Phillips gave legal protection, and Hardenbrook concealed the documents. The four elders had conspired to eliminate Van Garrett and widow Winship, ensuring there were no heirs. Masbath's father was drawn into the plot because he witnessed the new will, leading to his death. This way, Baltus Van Tassel would inherit Van Garrett's fortune. Back in his room, Ichabod found Katrina, who inquired about the investigation. He refused to tell her anything important and slipped the will into his drawer. When she left, Moss Bath found a symbol drawn under Ichabod's bed, warning him that someone was casting spells against him. Later that night, Ichabod and Moss Bath followed a hooded figure into the woods. Moss Bath waited by a tree as Ichabod went further. Hidden among the trees, Ichabod saw Lady Van Tassel making love with Reverend Steenwick. She dug a dagger into her hand and wiped the blood on the man's back. Ichabod and Moss Bath returned home to find the new will had been stolen. Ichabod rode to the old cottage and caught Katrina burning the will to protect her father. They argued about their feelings and his sense of justice, and Katrina bid him goodbye. Ichabod spoke to Lady Van Tassel, but Katrina still refused to talk to him, confronting him about what he saw the previous night and asking him to keep it from her husband. Just then, Lord Van Tassel entered and announced that Hardenbrook had killed himself. Reverend Steenwick called a meeting at the church where everyone would speak against Ichabod. Van Tassel advised him to leave immediately. As the townsfolk gathered at the church, Van Tassel waited for his wife on his horse while she picked herbs for her wound. Suddenly, the headless horseman appeared from behind the trees and chopped off her head. Van Tassel rushed to the church and warned Katrina that the Hessian had just killed her stepmother. They ran inside as the horseman arrived, but he couldn't enter the church. The townsfolk shot at the Hessian through the windows while the town elders argued. Van Tassel drew his gun as Dr. Lancaster confessed that they were bewitched and forced to plot against Van Garrett. Before he could finish, Reverend Steenwick hit him on the head, killing him. Van Tassel then fired at the Reverend, who backed away and threatened everyone with his gun. Suddenly, the window shattered, and Van Tassel was harpooned by the headless horseman, dragged out of the church, and beheaded. Katrina fainted as Ichabod noticed pink chalk near her palm, realizing she had drawn the symbol under his bed. Ichabod and Mosbath took Katrina home, but she remained unconscious. Ichabod suspected she had brought the horseman back to life. He called for his carriage and prepared to leave. As he passed through the village, he saw the townsfolk carrying Lady Van Tassel's body into the morgue. He opened the spellbook Katrina had given him and learned that the symbol was a protection spell for loved ones against evil spirits. Realizing his mistake, he asked the carriage to turn back. At the morgue, Ichabod inspected Lady Van Tassel's corpse and found a cut on the hand made after death. This wasn't Lady Van Tassel. Meanwhile, back at the house, Katrina fainted upon seeing her stepmother alive. Lady Van Tassel took Katrina to an old windmill, with Mosbath secretly following them. She cut a lock of Katrina's hair and used it in her spell. It turned out that Lady Van Tassel was behind everything. She stole the headless horseman's skull and made a pact with the devil to bring him back to life to do her bidding. She summoned the Hessian from the tree of the dead one last time to kill Katrina. When Katrina woke up, Lady Van Tassel revealed her true nature. She had killed one of the maids, Sarah, and used her body to fake her own death. Her real name wasn't Mary Preston, but Mary Archer. Her family had lived in an old cottage and served the Van Garretts for years. When her father died, they were evicted and became outcasts living in the woods because her mother was suspected of witchcraft. After a year, her mother died, leaving Mary and her sister to fend for themselves. While gathering firewood, Mary witnessed the horseman's death and offered her soul to the devil to bring the Hessian back to life for revenge. She killed the town elders and anyone who knew her plot, including her own sister, the witch who lived in the woods. She planned to kill the Van Garretts, who starved her family, and the Van Tassels, who stole their cottage. All that was left was to kill Katrina, and she would have everything she wanted. As Lady Van Tassel talked, Mosbath crept behind her with a hammer, but she turned and made him drop it. Katrina and Mosbath ran out of the windmill just in time to meet up with Ichabod. The horsemen chased them back to the mill, and they barred the doors. They climbed to the roof as the Hessian knocked down the door and chopped the ladder. Ichabod and the others made it to the roof and dropped a gaslight, hoping to burn the horsemen alive. The three grabbed hold of the windmill and jumped as it neared the ground. They ran away just as the windmill exploded in a massive blast of fire, but the headless horseman survived. The three rode a carriage, with Katrina taking the reins as Ichabod shot at the horseman. He was knocked down by a tree branch, but managed to jump back to the carriage and push the horseman back to his own horse. As they were both dragged by their horses, Ichabod made his way back to the carriage and faced the horseman. A struggle followed, and the other two jumped to the horses as the carriage broke free. Ichabod grabbed hold of the reins as the carriage strayed away and crashed into a ditch with the Hessian. Ichabod, Katrina, and Mosbath arrived at the tree of the dead and faced Lady Van Tassel, who shot Ichabod in the chest. She grabbed Katrina and ordered the headless horseman to take her. Ichabod regained consciousness, realizing the book of spells had saved his life. He jumped at Lady Van Tassel, causing her to let go of Katrina. The two struggled to get a hold of the horseman's skull. Meanwhile, Mosbath grabbed a branch and knocked out Lady Van Tassel. The horseman grabbed Katrina and was about to chop her head off when Ichabod threw the skull back to him. The horseman regained his head, breaking the contract and freeing himself from Lady Van Tassel's control. Ichabod and Katrina embraced, realizing her gift had protected them. The Hessian, now with his head, took Lady Van Tassel into his arms and gave her a bloody kiss. She realized she had lost and screamed as the horseman dragged her into the tree of the dead and into the depths of hell. The three watched as her remaining arm disappeared, knowing it was finally over. Afterward, Ichabod married Katrina and brought her, along with Mosbath, to New York City, where they began a new and blissful life together.